Thank you. As Martina mentioned, I am from Xiphon. I'm currently the VP of Clinical Informatics, and my background has been many, many years teaching, doing a lot of research and data, aggregating data across specialties. As Martina mentioned, we're going to talk about precision medicine. We're going to talk about reimbursement. I know it's not the most exciting topic, but what we're going to try to accomplish today is a kind of a framework. Talk about how the data is generated, who needs to see it, how it gets used. And we will talk a little bit about multidisciplinary teams in that landscape as well, because labs don't operate in their silos, and neither do practicing physicians like community oncologists. They are interdependent upon each other. We've got 3 learning objectives today. I hope that you walk away with most of the information to meet these learning objectives. This is not a lecture, so if you have any questions, just be sure to stop me and ask any questions that you have. Okay, so we're going to review the basics very quickly. This kind of sets the stage for the talk in general. We're going to talk about precision medicine, as we mentioned. It's going to be a topic throughout this discussion. We're going to introduce the concept of real-world data and real-world evidence development. What do we mean by stakeholders? We're going to talk about them, who they are. I can tell you one of the major stakeholders is the patient in this mix. Everybody's super favorite topic of value-based reimbursement, value-based care, the transformation thereof. It's coming. We can't avoid it. It's all based on quality. It's about coordination of care. I mentioned the interdisciplinary diagnostic and treatment journey. There's no space between that, I noticed. Anyway, we're going to talk about that, and we're going to look at community oncology, because a lot of cancer patients get treated in the community setting. Not all of them go to big academic research centers like Huntsman and the university. And then we're going to talk a little bit about clinical trials. And in the context of clinical trials, what we're going to talk about is what kind of data is necessary in order to enroll patients in trials, find them, and increase enrollment in those trials. Okay. This is a primer on precision medicine. It's really, a lot of you already understand this, but we're going to go ahead and get started. It's really about the personalized treatment of disease. It's really a model that tailors treatment, medical decision, even testing to a specific patient. This DNA, no single patient is the same. They're all unique. So it's a real shift in the paradigm of treatment, basically, from those fire hose treatment, one giant treatment for everyone, to a very targeted treatment, personalized for any given patient, based on their testing, based on guidelines, based on evidence. I wanted to talk a little bit about precision medicine, where it started. This month is breast cancer awareness, so I thought I'd take and use breast cancer as an example. There are so many indications now in precision medicine, but we're going to talk about this. Actually, the real concept of precision medicine actually was coined about 100 years ago, when physicians could remove the ovaries of a female to induce menopause. But the actual application of the term precision medicine started about 45 years ago. When you started to look at hormone receptor tests to direct hormonal therapy in breast cancer, tamoxifen was one of the very first drugs. It was FDA approved in 1977. Doesn't seem like that long ago, but it was a long time ago. And what they were able to see is a greater than 40% response rate in metastatic breast cancer patients. Then came on the combined tamoxifen with aromatase inhibitors, which allowed for a combination therapy, if you will. It was really for targeting premenopausal women that were estrogen receptor positive. And it became the standard of care in postmenopausal women as well. Herceptin, that everyone knows about that, I'm sure in this room as well. It's really a therapy for metastatic metastatic breast cancer in the neoadjuvant setting or even adjuvant setting. So neoadjuvant treatment before surgery, adjuvant after surgery. It really targeted that proto-oncogene, and really 15 to 20% or even greater probably now, the breast cancer tumors actually responded favorably to that. It was a HER2 positive MBC, metastatic breast cancer, and it was FDA approved in 1998. In 2006, it was approved for early stage breast cancer. So metastatic breast cancer is usually late stage or advanced. Early stage is usually stage 1, stage 2. Staging is really important in these discussions. I'm sure everyone's heard of Keytruda, Pembro. It was basically targeting triple negative, high-risk triple negative breast cancer patients with a PD-L1 or PD-1 receptor. It's a targeted therapy, and it boosts immune response to fight against cancer cells. Really, precision medicine, something that oncologists and laboratories practice together, but it really started to become very important to oncology in cancer treatment. It's a shift in the paradigm from these toxic substances to more targeted therapies. They're not without their side effects, but they're very targeted at very specific molecular cell types within an individual or population. It really opened the door for precision oncology because the diagnostic, therapeutic, all the innovations that you see coming are actually now they're adopting in oncology to treat patients. Really effective, more precise treatment, and really allows for new companion diagnostics to be developed, as well as expand the current indications. The FDA has approved over 207 drugs. I'm sure there's more of them, but this is basically through 2021. They really focus on medical oncology and hematology. And 14% of those drugs actually replace first-line treatment. So that was first-line therapy in patients that were diagnosed with cancer. The rest were later stage or combination therapies and add-on therapy types. I think that this data may be slightly dated. It's 2023. I suspect there's a whole lot more. One of the interesting companion diagnostics that has been developed and really understood well is non-small cell lung cancer. EGFR inhibitors, greater than 85% of those are now can be treated with a targeted therapy of their 3 subtypes. There's always stakeholders in this. I want to mention the stakeholders. I mentioned that the patient is the primary stakeholder in the precision medicine landscape. Laboratories play a significant role. Oncology plays a significant role. Payers play a significant role because of value-based reimbursement. Patients are the ultimate stakeholder, as we mentioned, and all of this benefits the patient. But I am going to tell you that there are a lot of other groups out there that are keenly interested in how laboratories and oncology groups are working together because they want to use your data. Because they develop new drugs and they study new indications and they develop new assays. So we can't really talk about precision medicine without understanding real-world data and real-world evidence. Now, again, this is just a review of all of this. And if anybody has any questions or suggestions, please feel free to jump in. Real-world data really is about longitudinal patient data that comes from a variety of systems today. It's EMR data, EHR claims, lab tests, patient-reported outcomes, and it's very longitudinal in nature. Real-world data, they collect it today because they meaning the government and other entities, especially the FDA, collect it because they use that to develop real-world evidence from that package of real-world data. it does support regulated bodies, including, I mentioned FDA, but also CMS. And I'll talk a little bit about an example of why they collect real world data and what they use it for. And actually, it's a great opportunity to use machine learning and develop AI data models around it. As I mentioned, it's used to develop real world evidence. Real world evidence is what you can think is the outcome, if you will, of the data collection in real world data. It's derived from real world data. They use it for regulating all these different biologics, drugs, and devices. We talked about FDA. Some of you will recall that a laboratory that goes by the Foundation of Medicine was able to utilize real world data and real world evidence to get their companion diagnostic approved and covered. They didn't ever ever conduct a clinical trial to use that evidence. We also know and heard about the 21st Century Cures Act. That is something that was really kicked off what we call real world evidence today. And it is really about evidence-based medicine, practicing that in the real world patient setting. Okay. Okay, this is a publication by Vivek Sabua. He's a colleague of mine, and I wanted to just put this in there, but I just want to tell you that what we know as real world data today is probably going to change quite a bit. When you start to get the looking at this longitudinal model from these current systems that we have, and by the way, it's not easy to collect it today anyway, but this is going to really shake up that landscape. I think what you're going to find is the deep learning, and people toss that term around quite a bit, but you're going to find that there's opportunities for that deep learning with that data set. And it's kind of like an iceberg, I think, is the best way to, the best analogy. Most of it's still sitting under the surface. So when you start to get all these different systems that are contributing, we're definitely not there today, but I suspect it will change the standard of care in cancer delivery. And you're going to see that exponential increase in the types of data. And you're going to see transformation in probably 5 years to 10 years out. You'll see transformation. So one of the things that I think is important here is, and I was talking to some of you earlier about the interdisciplinary nature of cancer care. The laboratories, oncology, practicing physicians order those tests, and really how does it impact value-based reimbursement? I know that that is not the most exciting topic of the day, but it's important that we talk about it because it is something that is coming, and it's based on quality of care. And that quality of care is going to be really looked upon when you get these teams together and coordinating care in that environment for a patient. You'd be kind of surprised to hear maybe that it was first introduced in 1967. This is not a new thing. And it was introduced because the patient-centered medical home in pediatrics, they needed patients and doctors in the multidisciplinary team to coordinate because these kids were really sick. So that's where the patient-centered medical home comes in too. Didn't know that. I learned that while I was putting this talk together. It was evolved really to today to tie reimbursement to the quality of care provided. Quality, quality, quality is going to come up over and over again. How do you establish it? How do you provide it? How do you report on it? I think that I think in the near future, the entire healthcare system is going to be payments and reimbursement are really based on performance. They are today in hospital systems, but I think you're going to see that happening more and more and more, and it's hitting oncology as well as today. So they're looking at quality and how do you measure it and how do you report on it. I'm just going to pause for a minute. Anybody have any comments? We're all good to go? Okay. Excellent. Okay, so I've talked about the interdisciplinary team. Let me just tell you that laboratory science and precision oncology have the same challenges. They're looking at contraction. They're looking at value-based reimbursement. How do you survive? How do you report? And how do you treat patients in a way that you're not seeing physician burnout, but you're also treating the patients with the best? And how do you deal with precision medicine? Because there's so many new tests coming out. There's so many new drugs coming out. There's so many new guidelines coming out. And how do you work with that? So there's that reimbursement issue. There's post-COVID and post-COVID. There's anti-kickback. There's also in oncology adoption of telehealth. So patients are not going into the oncology clinic. Now these patients are really sick, so you know why they're not going in, because they really, really are vulnerable and compromised. There's a lot of regulatory requirements on both sides. There's the cost of the development for the laboratory, but there's also a high drug cost on the oncology side. So those oncologists, when they order a test from the laboratory, they need to make sure they're ordering the right test at the right time to treat the patient, because those drug costs are very expensive, $10,000 to $14,000 a month. And then, of course, the denials and appeals conundrum. That is a loop. As soon as you get into denials and appeals, you've already started losing money. So adding on to the discussion around the interdisciplinary approach, this really starts with a patient visit. This is a really high level flow diagram. And it's really just to really illustrate what happens with a patient. Visit, imaging, pathology, usually through surgery and sending the sample to the pathologist, additional laboratory testing with modalities, for example, FISH for reflex, as well as NGS or other types of testing methodologies, to the clinic to get a PET CT, and then into the oncology treatment cycle. I want to point out here that when a patient has been diagnosed with cancer, they get a pathologic stage. And I put that here because I think this is going to come back later on in this presentation. When a pathologist looks at your tissue under a microscope, those of you laboratory scientists in the room are going to probably correct me here a little bit, but when a pathologist looks at the tissue, they give a pathologic stage. That means they give a stage value that determines the type and advancement of the cancer, so to speak. When the oncologist gets that information and they get additional laboratory information and they get the radiology CT imaging and they compare it to the PET CT, they determine what the clinical stage looks like. That clinical stage is used to treat the patient. But that oncologist needs that pathologic staging, as well as the information that the laboratory can provide, so that they can actually design a treatment regimen that is personalized for the patient. This is complicated. I have violated every single PowerPoint rule in the world here, but let me just say that the purpose of this slide is really to demonstrate how much goes on when a patient is diagnosed with cancer and all the different specialties that are involved. And you say, well, what does this have to do with us? Well, I'll tell you what it has to do. If you can coordinate your care and it's considered high quality because you have the care team involved, it becomes very reportable. That means you're participating in the best possible treatment that you can deliver to a patient. Okay, this is everyone's favorite, I'm sure. Let me just say that the GTR, the genetic testing registry that's maintained by the NIH, basically keeps track of all the new tests that are coming out and the genes that are being tested on. And this year, there were 74,603 tests. And it hovers around 74 to 78,000, just depends. Now, those are all genetic type testing. It really does track the purpose and the methodology and validates the validity of the test, because what they're trying to do is make sure that anything that they're tracking is useful. So I put this on here because it also is a companion to the NCCN guidelines. This is non-small cell lung cancer. This is another violation of all the PowerPoint rules. But let me just say that the reason why this is important is because these are guidelines and they're pathways that you follow when you order one of those tests that happen to be listed on the GTR, the genetic testing registry, and you order one of those tests for your patient. You have to follow this guideline. If you're going to use that test, you'll want to follow the guideline because you won't get reimbursed. But if you follow the guidelines and the standard of care, you will be in line. You will probably have a least likely appeals or denials process. They publish these guidelines on purpose for that reason. I'm just going to go through this appeal process because that's what Xiphon's core competency is. There are people that are a lot smarter than I am that actually can discuss this at a lot greater depth. But there's two types of appeals, in my opinion. There's the administrative appeal, and there's a comprehensive appeal. The administrative appeal really just requires that you have pieces of data in your appeal process. The comprehensive appeal is more reliant on having clinical information that comes usually from your ordering physician's office. That means that you need to have a way to exchange the data with each other to make it easier on yourselves. What you really want is to understand what medical necessity really means for your laboratory and how you can pull that data together in a way that you can reuse it and establish a dialogue and relationship with your ordering physician practices. Everybody probably also knows this, but we're just going to go over it. Basically, this is the kind of information you need to have for your appeal. The patient information is important, but the medical history and the family history is also important. Sometimes it's missing. And even sometimes you need to have additional bits and pieces of information about the diagnosis that is not part of the path report. You'll want to also have these previous test results current. You have to establish the medical necessity, you also have to have the guidance for the medical intervention. And how does it impact the patient? So you've got to have all these, you've got to be thinking along these lines because you really need to understand treatment effectiveness, because all of this information becomes really important when you're in the appeal cycle. So I happen to know that there are people like Adabek in this room that can talk a lot more in depth about that particular approach. And we talk about comprehensive appeals. These are really important as well, and it takes it one step further. It really, to get a comprehensive appeal, you really have to have your physician's a tight connection with your physician, ordering physician practices. Okay. We did a research project internally, and we were looking at the NCCN HBOC coverage. So hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, we really wanted to look at the payers and who was paying and who wasn't. So we looked at, and we use NCCN HBOC testing as criteria for this one. We wanted to look at the coverage and the non-coverage. We looked at denials data, and we also looked at crosswalk behavior between. And this is what we came up with. This is a generalized analysis. And what we found was, depending on the payer, if you had the right information, and some payers don't cover all the tests, you can see the green, and let me just go, you're probably going to read it here, but the green is an exact match with the NCCN guidelines. Their red indicates there might be something missing. Yellow is very restrictive. And so what you had is in Mississippi, they were more, or I should say, less restrictive than others in, like the Aetna plan in general. So really, we only looked at BRCA 1 and 2 testing, and we looked at the NCCN, but we also took into account that the U.S. Preventive Task Force actually makes recommendations on reimbursement as well as ACOG and ACMG, the genetic groups that are out there. So it's not just NCCN is the long-term message here, right, out of the gate. We also published a couple of papers in the AACC. Looked at those tests that I mentioned. 80% NGS denials rate with this particular paper is actually 2 years old. We demonstrated that if you could get clinical data, you could use it for adjudication upon appeal, and real world evidence really to support clinical utility, coverage with evidence development, and payer risk sharing arrangements. Payer risk sharing arrangements are actually more prevalent in oncology, I think, but you could use this data for that purpose. And then one thing that we mention here is trusted partnership arrangements. Laboratories could benefit greatly if they had established relationships with their physicians, because you can't really go visit them anymore. Can't go call on people anymore, especially post-COVID. And those oncologists are thrilled with that, by the way. They don't want to spend, they're already in clinic all day long, right? They don't want to spend a lot of extra time talking to a representative. Okay. So I talk about that. So what? It's important to have all this information together. Yeah, we know that we work with our oncology groups, but what else can we be working on in order to look at this evidence so we don't hit, appeals all the time, or we can start to make progress down the path to reimbursement. Peer-reviewed publications, I know that especially here at Marriott, I'm sure that a lot of publications go out because you have to have those publications peer-reviewed in your health technology assessments for approval for your assay. We also know that the payers look for the clinical practice guidelines. That's what they pay on. The payers can have a narrow network. That clinical practice guideline especially happens in oncology all the time. They take those and they narrow them. And then subject matter expert opinion, that means your clinician is ordering your test. If you're in a laboratory, and outside a peer review if you're in oncology. So really, it's really the burden of proof, basically. You have to prove that your tests are high quality, right? And how is that information gets presented to payers? You have to be able to pull it together. And there are groups that I'm sure you're all familiar with, like the MolDX program, that is also, and other payers programs that they evaluate those tests. I just also want to touch on something that I've been talking about for a long time, but it's the medical dossier, and it's sort of the culmination and the summary of everything we've been talking about with interdisciplinary teams and sharing data and establishing relationships with your ordering physicians, as well as the physicians being able to give back to the laboratories the information that they need for value-based reimbursement. But I call that a medical dossier because if you can get that information together and you have a framework for it, and a template, so to speak, it just becomes routine. It's part of the quality initiatives in value-based reimbursement. I keep using that word interdependencies, but interdisciplinary and interdependence are about the same in my opinion. So really, this is just more information about some of the research that we've done around laboratory and clinical data integration. Because really, what XIFIN really is looking at having is, and really providing, is a means to have a clinical data repository for their laboratories. Sometimes you don't think about it, sometimes you do, but how do you pull in data if you don't have something there where it lands in a way that you can use it in a, in a structure, so to speak? So we decided to do another little research project, and we did this with ASCO and presented it at ASCO. And really the heart of it was to figure out what we needed what was going on with medical necessity. You know, that medical dossier, I love that term. So what we discovered at that time was that 80% of NGS and 40% of molecular tests were being denied. We saw that in the data, and they saw it in their data as well. 55% of the denials were overturned if you had that medical dossier, if you had the components that could put together a medical dossier, you could get those overturned. How many times? We didn't get exactly all of that, but we knew that they were overturned 55% of the time the first try. What we had to include was the ICD information about the cancer diagnosis and staging. If you remember, just a few minutes ago, we talked about, gotta keep myself on track here. We talked a little bit about the staging. You got to have that staging information because that's really important, because AJCC, American Joint Commission on Cancer, dictates that staging methodology and those pathways. You also want to get those staging, but the metastatic diagnosis codes, those are also known as ICDO codes. So those are very special codes that are used in oncology, but they describe the tumor. And then treatment plan information. This together was integrated so that they could use it for appeals, and they could also use this. We could also use this for evidence-based coverage decisions. It's all about high quality data and evidence. I'm going to talk, let's see, how much time do I have left? 10 minutes? 15? 15? Excellent. Okay. Basically, I want to talk about community oncology. So we've talked a little bit about the labs and the challenges in the labs. We've introduced oncology. Now we're going to shift a little bit to community oncology, but the adoption of precision oncology. So let me just tell you that a community oncology is actually oncology that's delivered in the community, not at Huntsman Cancer Institute, not at the hospital, in the community where the patients live. They're usually physician-owned practices. They treat 55 to 75% of cancer. That's growing and shrinking every day. But there's a big chunk of patients that get treated because they treat them in Delta, Utah. They drive down, they have a clinic down there, and they treat them in that clinic. As I mentioned, they're not seen as an academic or large IDN health system. And there are varying reports out there that state that there's a cost savings of going to a community oncology practice of about 40 to 50% over a hospital. And I think that probably can be debated because there's a whole lot of publications out there that state numbers, but they fall a little bit into that range. There's some challenges in the community oncology setting. The limitations of their EHRs. These people don't use Epic and Cerner. They have very specialized EHRs. They usually don't have the capability of storing additional information in a structured way. They also, in the community setting, the most information, the most relevant information is stored in the clinical notes. And the reason that is because the oncologist uses the clinical note like a story about the patient and their diagnosis, and talking to them and having a discussion and dialogue with them about their treatment plan as their medical legal documentation for billing and reimbursement, basically. One of the things that we found in our research with our community oncology partners is that they wanted something that allowed them to analyze their data based on key clinical elements. And really not clinical decision support, but how do we use our data so we can enroll patients in trials, or we can do manual chart, we get away from manual chart review. Well, what we found, back to that staging information that I mentioned earlier, is that it's only complete in the medical record by about 65% of the time. And these genomic tests, they are not complete either. Sometimes they're buried in a clinical note. They're not in a structured field. You can't do anything with them. They come in as a PDF or not at all. And then, of course, surgery information is missing altogether because in the community oncology setting, surgery centers are generally outside of that practice. So when they have to order up that tissue sample, they have to call the biospecimen repository or the surgery center, and they have to order it. It has to be sent out to the laboratory for testing. We did a little bit of a use case here, a research project, and we published these results. So with our partners at Utah Cancer Specialists, they wanted to get into real world data aggregation. They wanted to link the clinical data with the disparate genomic and molecular data and other results. And they wanted to also bring in financial data, but mostly we focused on treatment regimens, drugs, and diagnoses. Interestingly enough, they wanted to accomplish chart review, automate their chart review process. Does everybody know what chart review means in this room? Well, let me just tell you what it is. You go, get your spreadsheet, you go to the EMR after hours so that you don't use it. You find patients that you want to look at, and you read their entire chart manually. That's a whole lot of time and a whole lot of work, right? I'll get to that in a minute here. They also wanted to be able to flag patients for clinical trials from the same data set. They didn't want to have here, go here, go here, and go here, because those systems are all just disparate from one another. They also have oral oncolytics. These are oral drugs that are really expensive as well, but they usually are inside the practice. They don't buy them from McKesson or Cardinal. I mean, maybe they do, but my point is they're different from these infusions in the cancer clinic. Guess what? They are under pressure with value-based reimbursement. I already said that. I think I've said that so many times everybody can repeat it back to me. And they also wanted to look at these oncology practices, also wanted to be able to look at social determinants of health. They want to see what their patient population is, what their health equity profile looks like, disparities in their practice population. And then all of those items went to the clinical research, pharma, because they sell data to pharma and they work with data. So for drug discovery and payers, back to that value-based reimbursement. Let me just tell you, I just explained the manual nature of chart review. It is painful. What we did, well, we were able to save them about 20 hours because what we did is we brought all the data together, we put it in a repository, we developed tools on top of it, and we were able to provide a way that they could click, find, identify, and bring those patients out. So that when the research team was going to go back and look at those patients, they still have to validate that that patient is who that patient is. And basically, it cut their time in half. Now, there's other implications for that. One of them is being able to, when a person like a pharmaceutical company or manufacturer comes in and they want to be able to buy data for drug discovery, which they do all the time, what they can do is they can provide that to them in a very clean way. And they can take the money into the practice instead of having to pay for an external person to do the review. Okay, I'm going to get through this very quickly. These are the use cases that we came up with. Triple negative breast cancer. We were able to put the data together so they could identify all their TNBC types and subtypes. We brought in filters for race and ethnicity and geographic region. It's important because breast cancer patients in Utah and northern Utah are maybe slightly different in southern Utah. And remember, I talked about social determinants of health. We also wanted to be able to look at that. We wanted to link the disparate results, BRCA1 and 2. Those are also in that data set. We broke those down in their discrete elements and we linked them to the clinical data. So we could look at the genotype and phenotype diversity back to the north, to the south of the state. And then ideally, we want to be able to identify patients for further research. We did the same thing for test utilization, same approach. Discrete elements of data, we broke it down, we linked it to the clinical information because these physicians want to know, why is it taking longer than 21 days to get my test results back? And we could look at every single laboratory that they ordered from, and they could say, we're not ordering from them anymore. basically back to that, establishing that relationship with the laboratories and that customer service link that comes back to the practice and that the practice gives back to the lab. Okay, I won't talk about the ontology, but we'll go on. Interestingly enough, everybody talks about advanced machine learning and AI, and I think it's all really great. And large language modeling, yeah, we're touching on that a little bit. But guess what? Oncology is so complex, and there's so many things going on that we basically had to figure out, how do you just get the staging information? Remember, a couple slides back, we talked about staging of the cancer patient, why it's so important. Well, 65% of the time or so, the medical record had staging information in it. The other percent, 35% of the time, there was no staging information in a structured field. It was in the clinical notes. So we had to use NLP to go out and find it. And guess what? It was so difficult that we only addressed solid tumors, because heme and other large cell cancers and watch and waits were too difficult. Not only that, it got messy because you started to look at stage that was unrelated to the cancer diagnosis. So we developed some data models around that. And we also connected that to our clinical workflow so that anytime something happened to a patient, they could be tagged as a potential candidate for a clinical trial or some other use. Back to that chart. So one of the things that became very important is you'll have all these workflow issues going on in the clinical workflow, and you're missing data. So you're going to miss patients. This is just an example. It's hard to see this one, but believe it or not, in the research side of a clinical practice, they don't want anything fancy. They just want pick lists. Give me my patients and give them to me fast. Because guess what? I need to improve my enrollment in my trials that I'm hosting from some percent that's very low to a higher percent. They also want to look at treatment patterns across lines of therapy. This is really important when you're looking at reimbursement, value-based care, because you can map your patients. You can map your patient across first line, second line, third line therapy. You can look at those precision medicine targets based on those testing results that you ordered for that patient. And then a market share. Community oncology practices, they want to know about their drug usage, basically. Prescriptions, who's ordering what, how much is it costing the practice, because those drugs are expensive. And what they want to know is, can I zero in and how much of this drug am I using? It's kind of like tests. How many of these tests am I using from this vendor? How much of this drug am I using from this vendor? And when those pharma companies come knocking at the door, they want to know, are you selling my drug or are you selling my competitor's drug? Well, guess what? They can look at this very quickly. Okay. I just want to make a quick comment here. None of this happens without the patient. Patient engagement's a big deal. The value-based care aspect of it, yes. The continuity of care and retention of patients, yes. That relationship between the oncologist and their patient, they don't go see that oncologist one time and then go home. They go back to the oncologist because they're on a cycle of drugs that are have to be delivered in a very carefully timed sequence. If they fail that line, they will be back. They have to be retested at some point in time. That physician has to send them out to get imaging done so they can see if the tumors are responding to the treatment, because you can't ask a patient, how is your tumor doing today? You can't do that. You have to get them imaged at a radiology imaging facility. And patient consent is going to be a big deal in the future, because patient consent is giving the patient, notifying the patient of what they're consenting their patient to be used for. And it will be coming up because state laws are being passed every single day that address that issue. Okay, we're almost done. bear with me. I mentioned that the future of real world data looks like this iceberg. Not colored like that, but it looks like an iceberg. And so what I think we're going to see, because we're looking down the pathway of understanding this data that keeps getting larger and larger every day, it's exponentially increasing. What I think we'll see using large language modeling and biomedical reasoning frameworks and ontologies is the ability to have adaptive clinical trial enrollment. So if I go back to my manual chart review and my, I'll call it semi-automated chart review, we could reasonably expect that chart review may be a thing of the past with these types of technologies and this type of data. The data is going to be very granular and very large and not related. I think what you'll see is a new way to predict disease progression as well, because disease progression is tricky. You have to have a treatment plan regimen. You have to be able to understand what those constitutional symptoms are of the supportive medication or interacting or with the chemo or the targeted therapies or the immunotherapies. You have to be able to understand and know and talk to the patient. You have to be engaged in that process. You also have to be able to get their reported outcomes from the patient. That's a fairly new term, but I think people in oncology, the oncology practice try to accomplish that. And then you want to be able to use all that information, do something with it. It's a lot of information and it's unstructured, somewhat structured. Some of it is just like imaging. So what do you do with that? But there's huge opportunity in the future for this if you can apply these modeling technologies to it. Okay, we talked about all these items, really about knowledge sharing, interdisciplinary communication, barriers, targeted drug discovery, overturning denials and appeal, especially when you can look at the medical dossier, that I love to use that term. And also really the use of real world evidence and really how that supports the laboratories, laboratory science, and oncology. I just want to make sure to tell you that I didn't do all this myself. There are some really smart people that I work with at Xiphon, and they're in the data engineering space. And I wanted to make sure that I acknowledge their contribution to this, as well as my collaborators at Utah Cancer Specialists. And I'll provide the references for all of these if you want. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions? Throw one out there, I can answer. I'll try my best to answer it.
So the clinical NLP models you talked about, do you know any more about how they were trained? Like, did you hire annotators to go through these notes, and how did the annotators have the expertise to analyze clinical notes, that kind of stuff?
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm nearly deaf in one ear.
It's okay. The natural language models you talked about on the clinical notes, do you know anything about how those were trained? Like, did they have doctors review and annotate notes with the types? Did they hire and train annotators? These kinds of things.
I'm going to answer this question the best I can. So our team took, I think, 8,000 different lines, and we looked for, in the staging, we looked for anything that said stage. Now, physicians don't chart the same way. They don't write their clinical notes the same way, even in the same practice. So sometimes they'd abbreviate stage as STG. Sometimes stage has a numerical system in most cancers. So we limited it to solid tumor, number one, because we wanted to make sure that hemes are really complicated, right? And so are large cell cancers. We wanted to make sure that we had the disease type. So we used the disease type based on ICD-10 and ICD-0, as well as their subtypes, which are really ICD-0 codes. Sometimes that was spelled out. Sometimes there was no code, right? You just had to look at it. We also looked at cosine similarity modeling, so we could look at in the sentence structure, was the term stage near something that said your stage of your headache is pain levels high, right? So you wanted to get rid of the false positives, false negatives. And then we actually looked through all of the notes, a section of the notes, and actually published that model based on that. We're actually going to write a paper about it. It's going to go out and be published in peer review this probably in a couple months from now. But those are the preliminary results for that. There's so much room for improvement, but that's the basic of it. And by the way, the people in the acknowledgements, they're the ones that can answer that question for you in depth. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.